Hi everyone, this is Lucille. Welcome to our last week of class. I can't believe it's here. I'm excited, but it also seems bittersweet since I haven't gotten to see anyone for over a month. But I guess we carry on. And so I'll be starting off the presentation that Drew, Crystal, and I worked on for Kit Leak's operation in Western Australia. So giving an overview of his production system, talking about his current management practices for pesticide resistance, and then also proposing a future management plan to help combat that. So to start off, just a quick overview of where our presentation will go. We're going to start off by talking about who Kit Leak is. From our conversation with him, it seems like he is a really prominent grower in Western Australia and a really interesting character to talk to. Also talk about his cropping system, so the relevant crops and the relevant weeds. Give an overview of resistance in his system, talking about his current management practices, moving into the work that agriculture research groups do in Western Australia, and then finishing up with a nod towards the future, proposing a possible resistance management plan, and also talking about Kit's views on the future of farming. He had some interesting things to say about the impact of social license on the farming community. Okay, so yeah, we're going to start off by talking about who Kit Leak is. I thought this would be a great picture or post to share. This is from Dr. Stephen Powell's Instagram, but it just showcases how much of a family man Kit Leak is. It became really obvious in our conversation with him that he cares very much about being able to pass on the farm and being able to pass on the farm in great condition. And so we wanted to share this slide, just so we could get our bearings straight and figure out where in the world Kit Leak is. So his operation is out of Kellerberrin, which is in Western Australia. And this is about 2.5 to 3 hours away from Perth, which is right along the coast. And so that's actually where Kit spends most of his time, because at this point he's passed on the day-to-day operations, to the next generation. Awesome. And then this is actually a video that he shared with us on the day that we interviewed him. He was actually out operating the tractor, doing some seeding. And so I wanted to share this with you guys just so you could kind of see where, what the landscape looks like and what he is dealing with. And so, Kit is a 4th generation farmer. And because of his father's example, he has really put an emphasis on making sure that succession in his operation happened smoothly. It wasn't so easy for him when he took over the operation from his father, and so he's made this a priority. And then also, of course, making sure that he is managing the land responsibly. A lot of the land out there is leased, and so that becomes a concern in terms of, taking on land that may not have been properly cared for. And also, he talked a lot about his involvement with different researchers. So not just involvement in the terms of conducting research and being part of that, but also even cultivating friendships with them. And he also does work with different government agencies, a couple of which we'll talk about later in the presentation. So in terms of Kit's general approach to pest management, it became evident in talking to him that he really tends towards prevention techniques as opposed to getting to the point where he has to think about economic thresholds. And so, for instance, with weeds especially, thinking about how can we prevent weed seed set so that we're not having to deal with this in future growing seasons. But then also, being all about integrated management and employing approaches, not just even different, for instance, chemical approaches such as using different methods or modes of action, but also employing not just chemical management, but cultural practices as well. And being flexible in terms of the cropping system to make sure that weeds are being competed with and not allowed to proliferate. And so he has cultivated this relationship with Dr. Stephen Powell, who is a researcher out of Western Australia and does a lot of work in herbicide resistance. And it seems like his relationship with Dr. Powell really informs his pest management approach. He shared that about 23 years ago, Dr. Powell's told him that if you come across a good management tool, don't continually use it because of the danger of resistance evolution. And so that has really informed his approach, and that's why he makes sure to get the integrated piece of the management approach. He's made that really prominent in his system. And so this is an article actually that was published back in 2013. This is about Kit Leek. At the time of the article, he had just been elected to his second term on the panel for this corporation, which is the Grains Research and Development Corporation. They do a lot of work, I guess self-explanatory, in grains research, but he's there to sort of provide the on-the-ground experience and insight to help drive the direction that research takes. Okay, and so moving on, we're going to talk about the cropping systems and the pests that impact their cropping system. And so in terms of his operation, they deal strictly with crops, so they don't have any livestock. And he described this as a classic rotation, but because issues can arise, say, with profitability or even weed or pest management, he emphasized that being flexible is really important. And so, this is the typical rotation. So they'll start with wheat, move on to barley, put in canola to give the soil a break from cereals, head back into wheat, and then finish up with lupin and start the rotation over again. And he said that the system is really pretty good at keeping, pests at bay. But one thing he talked about a lot was the issue with profitability and expense. For instance, with canola, they grow GM canola, and even though that's helpful to put in after 3 years of cereal, because they'll do 2 years wheat and then 1 year barley, it overall during the growing season takes more chemical applications and is also expensive to start because of the GM component. And then lupin, which may yield better than canola, will sometimes fetch only half the price of canola, and so in some years it may not be profitable for them to grow that. All right, and so one thing that came up was, kind of the factors affecting pest issues. And these are really the 4 that stood out to us. So, first and foremost, really thinking about climate. So on the very right-hand side, this is an image of the precipitation regimes in this little section of Western Australia. And so where Fremantle is, that's about where Perth is. And Kellerberrin, which is where their operation is about just over 200 kilometers away, which puts them in this orange region. And the precipitation there is anywhere from 8 inches to about 13 inches in a year. So really very little precipitation, and that affects the pests that they see. Also, soil type. He talked about some of the paddocks being more prone to certain weeds because the soil isn't as healthy there, which probably limits the ability of the crop to compete, and so he'll see more proliferation there of weeds, and we'll have to control it more aggressively. And then also the availability of technology. So he brought up the Harvest Weed Seed Destructor and how that has changed how they're able to manage weeds specifically. And then also lease agreements. So he described the typical lease agreement in this area being 3 years, as opposed to what we see in the US, where it could be anywhere from several years to a lifetime. And so the incentive for farmers there to manage their land responsibly may not be as intense as it would be here, right? And so he described, his approach is always thinking about the land as if he owned it, or thinking that eventually he would buy it. And so that's his mindset, but that may not be other farmers' mindsets. And so where you have people managing the land less responsibly, of course, you're going to get more outbreaks of pest issues. Okay, so yeah, just a reminder again of where we are. You can see how precipitation changes with the satellite view, going from really, lush green from the coast to more arid in the region where he operates his farm. All right, and then this is just to showcase, I guess, the primary weeds that he deals with. And Crystal will pick up on the next slide to talk more about ryegrass, annual ryegrass, and wild radish. But he shared these photos with us. In the top left-hand corner, this is annual ryegrass that was resistant to one of the chemicals that he had used. And then moving over to the right, we have wild radish. Wild radish again on the very right-hand side of this slide. Annual ryegrass, it's a late emergent, so later in the season. And then bottom left we have Canada thistle. And Canada thistle we won't talk about so much more later. It's not one of the significant issues that he has, but he shared a few pictures of this with us, so I thought I would share it with you. And the issue with annual ryegrass and wild radish is not so much yield, but he said in terms of grain quality, if he comes to the elevator and the grain, if there's a lot of ryegrass seed or wild radish seed, that'll impact the profitability for the season. And then also wild radish is persistent.
The seed is persistent in the soil for a long time. So management of wild radish really needs to be consistent and aggressive.
Let's meet some of Western Australia's most notorious pests. In the Wild West down under, weeds are the main enemy, and the main issues that Kit faces are Lolium rigidum, known as annual ryegrass, rigid ryegrass, or just ryegrass, and also Raphanus raphanistrum, or wild radish. Lolium, or ryegrass, is native to Mediterranean countries of southern Europe and North Africa. It also spans to the Asian Gulf and Indian subcontinent, while wild radish is native to Western Asia, Europe, and parts of Northern Africa. In case the name doesn't give it away, annual ryegrass is an annual monocot. Its natural densities and yield reduction can vary greatly, depending on the initial state of the seed bank, as well as conditions such as weather of that season. The same can be said for wild radish in terms of the variability of its density. There are some pretty interesting studies showing at different densities there are pretty significant yield reductions. For instance, in wild radish, a study showed that 25 plants per square meter could cause a 7 to 11% reduction in a wheat system in Western Australia, where 100 plants per square meter could cause a 25 to 33% reduction. Ryegrass has an emergence timing that usually occurs after an initial autumn rainfall. A large proportion, 60 to 80%, is believed to emerge during that time. For wild radish, it can really emerge year-round, but the majority also emerges in the autumn and also throughout the winter. As mentioned, environmental factors play a pretty large role in the impact that these pests can have on crops. Early rain and temperature can really influence how much germination and how well and how competitive those plants are. On the flip side, a lot of times these weeds are controlled by granular pre-emergent herbicides. And in a lot of cases, a bit of moisture can actually promote that treatment and maybe help give more control. So it might be a win-lose situation. While our focus will continue to be our weed pests, annual ryegrass, and wild radish, we'll briefly mention some of the insect and fungal pathogens that could be an issue in the region. Though Kit tells us that he doesn't typically have to deal with many of these issues, occasionally he will have to use an insecticide to treat for worms that might munch down on young crops or flowering crops. And so these worms are typically worms that turn into moths, such as cutworms and armyworms. The use of insecticide is usually pretty efficient on them, and there's definitely a better time to treat them than others based on their life cycle. So the eggs usually are near the soil surface and they hatch, and then for 3 months they'll be larvae. This is a critical point for spraying during the first month. Then the second and third month of the larval period are critical for monitoring and scouting the situation. 5 to 6 months after hatching, typically in the fall, adults will emerge and then begin to chomp down on your crops. So if you didn't have a chance to treat during that more critical first month of the larval stage, then you might do as Kit has recommended and treat during the flowering stage. And for fungal pathogens in Kit's region, those typically aren't too big of a problem. A little closer to the coast, that could be more of an issue where it's a bit more warm and moist. But also as you get closer to the coast, you might see a little more potential for higher yield. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, I suppose. So some fungi that you might find in crops in Australia are the blackleg disease of canola and the stripe rust in wheat. Usually these are going to require a moist season, a season that's more wet than normal to establish in regions beyond the coastal areas. Kit mentioned that perhaps if it's going to be a wet year, you might use a fungicide, or maybe you wouldn't depending on your economic threshold, which we'll discuss briefly later. There are some tools available online to help predict if there's going to be spores in your region. There are some of those available currently through one of the websites that we have linked through the Australian government in our references. There's some pretty neat tools on there. And there's also recently been a report, I say recently, I guess it was 2014, time flies, but the wheat mosaic virus was reported in Western Australia in 2014. And it's still not very widespread, but I thought that was just interesting, that there's also a viral pathogen. So let's circle back around to our weed pests, and particularly in Kit's production system. So here are some chemical controls that Kit uses, and these pose a moderate or high risk for resistance evolution. So our moderate resistance risk also happen to be our pre-emergents. And these are things like Treflan and Boxer Gold and Secura. So Treflan is a microtubule assembly inhibitor. It's used on ryegrass and wild radish, and in the crops that we like to rotate, barley, canola, lupins, and wheat. Boxer Gold is a fatty acid inhibitor and also a very long-chain fatty acid inhibitor. It's good to use for ryegrass in barley, lupins, and wheat. Secura is also a very long-chain fatty acid inhibitor, and it's used for ryegrass control in lupins and wheat. And these are all pre-emergents that you would want to use typically granulars that you'd want to put down before there's a 3-leaf stage, at least. And as you can see, these are all labeled for control of Kit's main weeds in the cropping system that he rotates. And then he also uses some post-emergent chemicals that pose a slightly higher resistance risk. We have some ACC-ACE inhibitors, Select, which is good for ryegrass in canola and lupins. In addition, Factor is another ACC-ACE inhibitor for ryegrass to control canola and lupins. And we also have Intervix, which is a combination of 2 chemicals that are ALS inhibitors. And ALS inhibitors are a pretty wide range of chemicals, and they are also for controlling ryegrass as well as wild radish in barley, canola, and wheat. And so as you can see, these are a couple of different chemistries, but as we'll discuss in a moment, there is a bit of cross-resistance potentially between these chemistries. So some of the other methods that are used for control in Western Australia are cultural weed control, such as delaying sowing your seeds. You might do this to try and avoid having weeds germinating at the same time as your crops, so that you can try and stall competition. It might help you time the treatment of your weeds a little bit better with chemistry. Another method to use that can also help to decrease the seed density of weeds and also the density of the weeds themselves, and help to reduce the impact on yield from weeds, is to do more dense or narrow seeding patterns. And so reduced seed production could translate to less weeds in the future if you can cut down on how many seeds these weeds are producing. And then also you could just have less weed density competing with your crop. And so a 29-year study on narrow seeding in wheat did show that you would get less weeds, higher wheat yield. Another study in wheat showed that dense seeding reduced wild radish density. So increasing your wheat seeding density in a range to 200 to 400 wheat plants per square meter reduced wild radish seed production, as well as some reduction in crop yield loss as a consequence of that weed. And another study in barley, a linear increase in yield was shown as you increased the density of the barley. So that's just some evidence that using different seeding, such as different timing, using more seeds, more dense seeding, or changing the narrowness of your crop rows, are some ways that could help control weeds. And another type of cultural control could be to grow competitive cultivars. As we find certain cultivars that are more competitive with crops, those could be grown in addition as more QTLs and genes for traits to help crops be more competitive are identified. They could be screened more easily and potentially have more of these cultivars that we can grow and help inhibit some of this weed competition. And just briefly here, in Table 3 on the right, you can see a little bit of the effect of seeding rate on wheat yield loss and the presence of annual ryegrass. So you can see that when you use more wheat seeds, you get a higher yield. So another type of pest management is to sort of control the seeds of the weed that are left behind, either after or, in a more recent case, during harvest. So in older days, and likely still in some cases, growers might try and gather all of their debris and any sort of things where old weed seeds or parts of the seed bank may be stored into rows and burn them. Nowadays, we have new technology such as the Harrington weed seed destroyer. And so harvest weed seed control is a great way to help reduce the seed bank in following years. And that's usually a pretty strong indicator of how much competition, weed density, or yield loss that you might end up having. And I'll try to circle back around to this later when discussing resistance management, as it's a pretty good tool for that as well, as we're collecting those resistance alleles that might be in those seeds and preventing them from spreading on to the following year. So just briefly, some of the decision drivers that might go into these management choices. So you have your economic threshold, or you could have zero tolerance, or you could be somewhere in the middle, which from what I gather from research online, as well as what Kit tells us, is more of the case. Though, Kit does say that his philosophy is more about zero tolerance. And I asked him if he felt that that was common in the region, and he said that he feels that it is. So that's good. It seems like growers in the region seem to be able to think ahead and look at the bigger picture. And so several years ago, for one example, wild radish density was very low, and a farmer might not want to spend $25 per hectare to use a chemical to treat the entire field, or paddock, as they might say. And so AHRI launched a project to sort of investigate how much it would cost to hand weed, or do, this cultural or mechanical practice rather than actually treating the whole field. And it varied a lot by field. They found that it could cost as low as $5 per hectare to hand weed rather than to treat with a chemical. However, in some fields, it was going to be more than the $25 that the chemistry would cost. So that kind of goes to show that one size doesn't fit all, and there's lots of different factors that might go into these decisions. AHRI also has worksheets available where you can input specific parameters about your farm and determine if things like harvest weed seed control are economically feasible for you. Another example involves areas just beyond the coastal climate that aren't usually warm enough for fungi to proliferate, but perhaps there's going to be a warm, moist year where they might have a good year, the fungi that is. So would the grower want to spend the extra money to do a preventative fungicide treatment in case there is a moist, warm year? Or would they want to risk it and then potentially rotate anyway the following year to a crop that's a non-host to that fungi? For instance, if it's a wheat fungi, they might be able to switch to canola or lupins and no longer host that fungi. So if they destroy their debris from the previous year, as long as there's not more moist, wet years, in theory, that should help manage without having to pay the additional money for the fungicide the initial year. So let's move on to resistance. So our two main enemies here, and if we're calling them the supervillains, I think Lucille sort of coined the idea that all of these chemistries that these weeds have evolved resistance to are fallen heroes. And so there is quite a bit of resistance in these weeds. Annual ryegrass has not only cross resistance in the classic example of ACCase and ALS, but it also has multiple resistance in up to 6 different chemistries in Western Australia. And wild radish also can have multiple resistance, and it's resistant to all these different modes of action. So, they've learned to manage the resistance, as Kit says, but it does take a lot of tactics. Through Western Australia, some studies propose that almost all populations of annual ryegrass might have resistance to either group A or B. And so that's the ACCase and ALS. So, what do they do to try and mitigate this resistance in these weeds that are pretty detrimental to their cropping? So, one of the most important things they do is to detect. Kit likes to sort of do a preventative periodical test, even if there's no known resistance, just to try and catch anything that might be coming up. He did tell us that he was able to catch an unsuspected glyphosate-resistant ryegrass before it was really able to spread and cause a problem. And he told us that there's various services for testing. A lot of times, especially in the past, you have to send your seeds at the end of the season, and an entity such as AHRI or a private company might grow those seeds and actually treat them with chemical so that they can determine whether or not there's resistance. And Kit and I were sort of discussing how it's exciting in the future that we might have more molecular diagnostics where you don't actually have to send the seed and the tester doesn't have to actually grow the plant. Maybe they could test just from DNA in the seed, or if they do have to grow it, they could just grow a tiny seedling for DNA. So another service is Pest, and that is the Pest and Disease Information Service. And so they offer all kinds of services to detect pest, weeds, diseases, even animal pests, including insect pests, but also beyond that. They offer tons of testing and identification, emergency response. They have a 1-800 number you can call. They offer diagnostics. So they pretty much offer just this full list of services for growers to try and identify what pests that they have and some potential ways to treat them and determine if they're resistant and how to sort of overcome that resistance. And so for Kit, he likes to do self-scouting in his field, and he also consults with an agronomist. So if he sees something strange, something that didn't die, then he'll bring Ryan, his agronomist, out to take a look at that with him and make a plan for what they need to do. So just an overview of some resistance management practices. Some of the most important practices are probably rotating both your crop and your herbicide. So we'll go a bit more in detail in a moment, but mixing and rotating different chemistries each season is critical. Rotating to a different crop that might need different management practices so you're not using the same thing over and over again, and to help prolong and delay the evolution of resistance. And then another option could be to rotate to fallow or hay for a year or two, which might not be as profitable, but if you're trying to consider the overall big picture of yield loss from these resistant weeds, then it might be something to consider. And another huge thing that Kit mentioned is just to prevent any weeds from going to seed. Even if you don't know if they're resistant or not, just don't even take the chance. And a couple of methods for that might be a pre-harvest desiccation with a pre-harvest herbicide treatment, such as paraquat. You might mow down portions of the field to make sure that those weeds don't make it to seed. And then there's the cultural and integrated pest management, such as the harvest weed seed control and the different timing and density of your seeding. So to follow up on a few of those management practices, as mentioned, probably one of the most important strategies with chemicals in particular is to mix and rotate different modes of action. So for instance, AHRI mentions that you might have your different pre-emergent chemistries that you could rotate between each year. And they also found that mixing these chemistries helped to get rid of any resistant individuals in populations with known resistance. And actually, AHRI has a series of Another chemical strategy for resistance management is known as the double knock technique. In this, an initial glyphosate treatment is performed when plants are still very young to knock out the initial round of germination. And then 4 to 7 days later, paraquat is used to knock out any glyphosate-resistant individuals that may be present. And both of these carry a moderate resistance risk. However, if you look at Table 2, you can see the differences in using them individually or in rotation, or using the double knock technique. And you can see it greatly reduces the probability of glyphosate resistance all the way down to 0.00 using the double knock. So some other options are crop top spraying or spray topping. And this is using a non-selective or selective herbicide. And this can reduce wild radish and ryegrass seed set by 95 to 90% respectively. And again, there's also an AHRI Insight video on double knock as well. Desiccation can also be used with a pre-harvest herbicide application, such as paraquat. It can be used to dry down not only the grower's, say, bean crop, but potentially also any weeds that are present in the field. And that way you can go ahead and dry them down and potentially stop them from going to seed, hopefully stop any proliferation from occurring. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the 5-year resistance management plan with Drew, and that will actually cover many of these management topics in a bit more practical manner.
So now that we've kind of gone through the entire overview from Kit Leak's operation to Western Australian agriculture to what they deal with in terms of resistance and some strategies that they have implemented to mitigate this resistance, we're going to move on to our 5-year resistance management plan, which is going to focus on delaying and mitigating resistance, herbicide resistance to annual ryegrass and wild radish. So we're going to be utilizing the 3 pillars of integrated pest management, cultural, chemical, and mechanical methods. So starting off with the cultural methods, rotating crops is kind of the easiest one and an important one to implement, as it provides different planting dates to kind of keep weeds from getting too comfortable. And it also opens up other herbicide mode of actions to rotate and mix with. And then delaying, we're going to try to delay planting as much as possible without significantly hindering yield. Because what we're aiming at with this delayed planting is to try and allow as much of the weed seed to germinate, and then we're going to come through with a pretty heavy pre-emergent herbicide application to try to wipe them mostly out and give the crop kind of a clean slate to grow and emerge in a nice non-competitive environment, but also reduce the amount of stress and the reliance on the post-emergent herbicide applications to try and control what would be a very dense population of weeds. And then with narrow row spacing and higher seeding rates, what we're aiming at here is just to try to give weeds a more competitive environment, kind of choke them out, and just basically just try to choke the weeds out as much as possible. And then on the chemical side of things, we're going to try to rotate, mix, and utilize multiple modes of action within the same year. And like we kind of mentioned with the delayed planting, we're going to put a pretty heavy emphasis on pre-emergent applications, as there's just a greater amount of modes of action, and there's just more flexibility of what kind of chemicals you can use. Because post-emergent, especially with the annual ryegrass, options can be a little bit limited, as they've become pretty widely spread resistant to the ACCase and ALS chemistry. And outside of that, it's really kind of hard with the crops that we're going to be utilizing in our rotation to come up with some unique chemistry that effectively can control annual ryegrass while also being safe on the crop. So with that being said, we're going to try to utilize some herbicide tolerant traits to try to be able to hit these weeds with a different mode of action instead of just an ALS or an ACCCAs. And then lastly, we're going to try to finish off with basically one of the only mechanical methods that can be widely used, as there's not a lot of tillage used in Australia due to soil erosion and things of that nature. But as we've been presented to on this topic of harvest weed seed control, we're going to try to utilize this as we're conducting our crop harvest to try and clean up any potential survivors, especially focusing on that ryegrass, as there's a greater chance of, in my opinion, there's a greater chance in our system of the ryegrass, making and surviving all the way to crop harvest. And research has done a lot of focusing in on utilizing harvest weed seed control to control ryegrass. So now we're going to look into some of the specifics of our resistance management plan. And when looking at the table in the top right, these are the top 5 crops grown in Western Australia in terms of hectares planted as well as production. And what we're going to be utilizing in our rotation is 2 years of wheat, which is kind of the typical way of doing things in Western Australia. As you can see, wheat is kind of far and away the most popular grown crop in Western Australia and Australia as a whole. Then we're going to come back with canola, and specifically we're going to be using the triazine tolerant stacked on top of the Roundup Ready resistance trait. And then we're going to follow that up with another grain crop. We're going to be using barley, and we're going to be using the Clearfield system, which is resistant to 2 different ALS chemistries. And then we're going to finish off with lupins, which is a pulse crop, and it opens up some more herbicide options there. So taking a deeper look into what we're utilizing in terms of herbicides, like I said, we're going to try to put a pretty big focus on the pre-emergent side of things, as the options are just a little bit more open than the post-emergent. So we're going to start off in year 1 with the double knock strategy that we talked about earlier, coming in with Roundup, following that up with paraquat. And then in terms of post-emergence, we're going to try to utilize the herbicide EcoPower, which is a PPO inhibitor tank mixed with an MCPA, which is a synthetic auxin. So that should take care of the wild radish. And then also utilize an ALS herbicide, triasulfuron. And then in year 2, we're going to come back with, for pre-emergence, we're going to come with a pretty popular tank mix that has actually been kind of shown to almost reverse resistance. And so what we're going to be utilizing is a tank mix of Sakura and Treflan, which involves 2 different modes of action. One, a very long chain fatty acid, and trifluralin is a microtubule assembly inhibitor. Then we're going to follow that up with a tank mix of Velocity and Axial. And Velocity utilizes a PS2 inhibitor, tank mix with an HPPD. And then we're also going to be adding an ACCase in pinoxidin to try to get at that Italian ryegrass. And then we're going to try to, this is where we're coming with the canola, to try to break up the rotation after 2 years of wheat. And we're going to be utilizing the triazine tolerance and the Roundup Ready in order to try to, because especially with the ryegrass, post-emergence wise, we've used ALS and ACCase, and resistance is already kind of widespread with that. So we're kind of crossing our fingers, hoping our pre-emergence did a pretty good job, and that the ALS and ACCase inhibitors were able to do a fair enough job, and then come in with the harvest weed seed control to try to keep densities fairly low. So now we're going to try to utilize the herbicide tolerant traits in this canola variety to come at it from a different angle. But pre-emergence, we're going to use a product called Alliance, which uses paraquat formulated with amitrole, which is a it's an active ingredient that I believe just got reclassified because I don't believe uh, they either didn't have it classified right or they were just a little bit unsure. So that'll, introduce a kind of novel active ingredient to our populations. Then we're going to come post-emergence with atrazine due to the triazine tolerance, as well as glyphosate to try to provide some really effective control, and hopefully, this sequence of herbicides in year 3 does a pretty good job. And then in year 4, we're going to go back to a grain crop. We're going to use the Clearfield variety of barley. And for pre-emergence wise, we're going to come in with Boxer Gold, which is a formulation of S-metolachlor, which is a very long chain fatty acid, formulated with prosulfocarb, which is um, a fat synthesis inhibitor, but it's not um, a very long chain fatty acid inhibitor or an ACCA inhibitor. And then post-emergence, we're going to use Intervix, which is um, a formulation of 2 ALS products, which is marketed to be used with the Clearfield system. And once again, just kind of hoping that we can get effective enough control as these 2 ALS herbicides can control susceptible wild radish as well as um, annual ryegrass, and then come back in with the harvest weed seed control. And then lastly, we're going to finish up with lupins, which is a pulse crop. And then we're going to go back to the Sakura Treflan tank mix pre-emergent and follow that up with Sniper, which is picolinophin, and then we're also going to tank mix it with clethodim, and ACCA is hopefully going to be able to take out some of the Italian ryegrass with the picolinophin, targeting the wild radish. So as you can see here, we're utilizing, I think, a total of 14 different modes of action within this 5-year period, which we believe will do a pretty good job at delaying resistance. It was kind of a struggle, as there's not too many post-emergent products that are able to control both wild radish, and which is a broadleaf species, of course, and the annual ryegrass, which is a grass species. So I had to do a lot of digging into looking at which compounds are compatible with each other, and then also trying to utilize some of those herbicide tolerance traits, which allow for using products in crop to control both of those species, which otherwise we wouldn't be able to. So now we're going to kind of get into what we believe are some of the pros and cons of our plan. On the pro side, really did a lot of digging into trying to incorporate as many different modes of action as we possibly could, using mixtures, rotating each year to the best of our ability, utilizing sequential applications, and it was a little bit easier to find these different modes of action for the wild radish in comparison to the annual ryegrass. But that's where we kind of hope we can come in with the harvest weed seed control to be able to pick off any potential survivors that have made it to harvest, and keep densities low year after year. So I think we'll be able to be pretty successful with this current plan at delaying resistance, getting some nice high yielding crops, but on the con side, it is a very pricey operation. I tried to do some digging into getting exact numbers for the cost of each herbicide, but that was couldn't seem to be able to find the prices for each herbicide. And like I mentioned before, it was especially difficult, especially on the post-emergent side, to find viable herbicides to control ryegrass other than ALS and ACCA herbicides. So what I did is I tried to make sure that each year I was rotating between at least ACCA and ALS in order to try and be able to try to get as effective as control as possible. But that's, like I said, been hoping on the harvest weed seed control to be able to be picking off some of those resistant individuals. And this is a very, it is, there's a heavy reliance in our system on utilizing herbicides, which um, is just, I think, just given the circumstances, Australia is a little bit different than here in the U.S., where um, there's a lot of tillage in the U.S., various methods, mechanical methods. There's a lot of work going into cover crops and stuff like that, where um, it seems like in Australia that's just a little bit more limited. Um, and then with our rotation, we're using 5 straight winter annual crops, which, like as I mentioned on that table a couple slides back, we're utilizing 4 of the top 5 commonly grown crops, but yeah, they are all winter annual, which kind of hinders the ability to alter the planting dates for year after year too much. Um, and then, yeah, like I mentioned, I guess kind of a minimal amount of mechanical weed control can be implemented. So now that we've kind of detailed our resistance management plan, we're just going to finish off with some interesting thoughts and information that Kit had kind of detailed to us regarding collaborative management and some of the groups that he's been involved in. Because, as with our herbicide resistance management plan, we're going to be as openly collaborative as possible in trying to um, help mitigate resistance evolution on our operation as well as the neighboring operations. But Kit said that definitely early on, um, there was kind of there wasn't a lot of collaboration between growers with a lot of kind of, he said what he thought was like embarrassment, some shame in having resistance on your field. But, over the years, as it's become more and more uh, researched and known about, that kind of embarrassment and shame's gone away, as it's just kind of understood that it's almost inevitable. He also said that there was an attempt to try to conceal it as best as possible, as there was a fear that it was going to drive down the value of the land, which uh, really doesn't factor uh, in kind of current land evaluations. But yeah, Kit definitely iterated to us that early on there was definitely some hesitance to kind of share information regarding potential herbicide resistance. But now it's kind of a very collaborative, free-flowing of information. I think a lot of that has to do with uh, grower involvement in some of these groups, which we'll outline here on the next slide. So in Australia, the big group to kind of know about is the GRDC. It's the Grains Research and Development Corporation. It serves Australia as a whole. It's government funded, and it primarily focuses research on the more agronomic and crop production issues, whereas the AHRI has basically solely been created just to focus on pesticide resistance and conducting research along that avenue. Kit did mention that he has heard complaints about the kind of bureaucracy that can be involved in a government-funded um, corporation, and that some growers don't believe they've received their return on investment on being involved in this group, as they feel that their kind of more localized issues aren't being covered, which Kit did mention has kind of created a lot of smaller local groups that focus on the local issues, and these groups are often uh, funded by GRDC. And so some examples of some studies that Kit mentioned that have been conducted in some of these local groups are a lot of soils work, um, uh, in even trying to mitigate resistance, looking at kind of deep plowing, burying seeds, and then kind of leaving it for a while and hoping to run the viability out of those resistant um, seeds. And take a look here on this slide. Here's just another example of a GRDC funded research project. And then to end our kind of conversation with Kit, we just asked him about what his thoughts are on kind of just farming as it goes further into the future, what he thinks about it, and some of the transitions that stood out to him over his long tenure of farming. And one of the biggest issues he had about the future is um, kind of just the perception of farming that gets broadcast on social media and stuff like that. A lot of times from those not particularly that involved in farming. And so he's worried to the point that he thinks there can be such a negative spin on technologies such as Roundup Ready crops, even glyphosate, that he kind of fears that the social pressure could get large enough to the point that these technologies just won't even be around to utilize anymore, which would really make things just even more difficult in terms of managing and already tough to control pests. And it was interesting to hear from him that he said probably 7 years ago his biggest issue when he looked into the future was herbicide resistance. He said he was petrified of it. But within these last 7 years have come along some newer products and management tools that he didn't necessarily foresee. And so he said currently, in regards to his thoughts on herbicide resistance, he's not all that concerned about it, as he's on his operation, at least when talking to him, they've seemed to do a pretty good job at managing resistance. They've had, uh, I think more specifically with the ryegrass, some resistance pop up here and there, but when we were talking to him, uh, yeah, he really didn't have all that much in terms of resistance that he was all that concerned about or had to really deal with. But they've taken some very stringent measures, and I think they've implemented the right kind of operations and methods in order to uh, have things the way they are. And so it's definitely nice getting to talk to Kit and learn a little bit about Australian agriculture. It was definitely an experience, and so with that, that's kind of our presentation right there. Hopefully, um, you guys got something out of it because I know I certainly did.